Today's daf is daf Lamed Gimel, which begins with B'maika Mifligi. So just to reiterate, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, which is going to be the focus of our study today, on daf Lamed Beis Amid Beis. And the issue was whether you chayiv shtayim or achas in a case of Iser Chalal Iser. And if we turn back for a moment to Lamed Beis Amid Beis, we'll see that Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara argued in three cases. One is called Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos, the second is Balmum Sheshimesh B'Tumah, and the third is Zar Sha'achal Malika. So we'll go through a chazara of those three cases as we go through the sugya here on Daf Lamed Gimel. But in all three cases, Rabbi Chia is consistent and Bar Kapara is consistent. Rabbi Chia is always going to say that you chayiv shtayim, and Bar Kapara that you chayiv achas, only one. But Maika Mifli, what are they arguing about, Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara? And the Gemara answers, Be'isur kolel v'aliba de Rabbi Yossi. So once again, we're going to need a little bit of background, of introduction, and it'll be a review, which is always a good idea to review. There's a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon back on Daf Lamed Beis with regard to a case where there's an overlap of both of Eshes Ach and Achos Ishto. And Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion that Iser Chalal Iser, you can have both Isurim, one on top of the other. And that's based on a concept which is called an Iser Mosif. What does it mean, an Iser Mosif? So let's say, for example, Shimon marries Leah, and subsequently his brother Reuven marries Rachel. So Reuven and Shimon are brothers, Rachel and Leah are sisters. Once Shimon, at time T1, married Leah, then Rachel becomes Achos Ishto. She's an Erva to Shimon. At time T2, when Shimon's brother Reuven marries Rachel, Rachel, now becomes Eshes Achim. And that's where Rabbi Yossi says Yechayiv Shtayim, because of what's called an Iser Mosif. Why is it an Iser Mosif? Let's say there are other brothers, Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar. They would be allowed to marry Rachel until she gets married to Reuven, their brother. So with Reuven's marriage to Rachel, we have now an Iser Mosif, which means that we've added new people in the Iser. We took this woman named Rachel, and her Shem Iser Erva was, at stage number one, Achos Ishto vis-a-vis Shimon, and now she's Eshes Achim vis-a-vis not only Shimon, but Shimon's other brothers, Reuven's other brothers, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar. That's called an Iser Mosif because it's Mosif Acherim. Other people are now included in the scope of the Iser. So you have the Iser in the hub, and the hub sends out its spikes, and now we expand those spikes. The scope of the impact of that hub and its Shema Iser is now expanded. And that's where Rabbi Yossi says, Iser Chal al Iser. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, disagrees, and he holds you're only chayav achas. Even in a case where Shimon married Leah first, Reuven married Rachel second, even in that situation, Rav Shimon says you're chayav only achas, because ein Iser Chal Iser. That's an absolute rule. So the Gemara says that the machlokas between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara is the Iser Kolel V'Aliba de Rabbi Yossi. Now, What that means is that everything we've said until now really expresses the understanding and the view of Rab Chia. Rab Chia Savar, Rabbi Yossi, Be'isur Kolel. Rab Chia understood that according to Rabbi Yossi, Isur Chalal Isur in the case of Kolel, and Mechayev Tarti, therefore he brings 2 chatos if he violated this erva b'shogeg. Bar Kapara Savar, Bar Kapara had a different understanding of Rabbi Yossi, and according to him, even in a case of an Isur Kolel, lo Mechayev el Achada, Rabbi Yossi would agree that Ein Isur Chalal Isur, and you're only Chayev 1. And we're talking now not about an Isur Mosif, but rather an Isur Kolel. In the case of an Isur Mosif, there everybody agrees that according to Rabbi Yossi, you're Chayev Shtayim. And that's the case where subsequently, when Reuven marries Rachel, that's an Isur Mosif because it's Mosif Acherim, which means that the other brothers are now prohibited in a relationship with Rachel. However, in a case of an Isur Kolel, which is going to be these 3 cases that we mentioned, about which Rab Chia and Bar Kapara disagree, Bar Kapara is of the opinion that according to Rabbi Yossi, Ein Isur Chalal Isur Be'isur Kolel, and therefore lo Mechayev el Achada. Umay Isur Kolel ikahacha. So what in these 3 cases is the Isur Kolel? The Gemara says, Bishlema, I can understand the first of the 3 cases. That's called Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos. Why is Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos? He works and does malacha on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash, and he's a Zar, he's not a Kohen. Why is that called an Isur Kolel? Shemeikara, before we entered into Shabbos, originally during the Beis HaChol, Shari B'Malacha, the Asur B'Avoda. He's allowed to do all the 39 malachas. He's not allowed to do Avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. Asiyah Shabbos, now it became Shabbos, and Shabbos now engenders an Isur Malacha, the 39 categories of labor. And now comes the svara of Isur Chalal Isur Be'isur Kolel. Migu dekam mitzar b'malacha, since he now becomes Asur b'malacha by virtue of the fact that it's Shabbos, mitzar nami ba'avoda. Since Shabbos adds another dimension of Isur, namely Isur Malacha, therefore, we can say that since Shabbos engenders an Isur Malacha, therefore, it can engender an Isur Avoda Shebemigdash, which means that a Zar is Chayev Misa B'dei Shamayim for working in the Mikdash. And again, this is not an Isur Mosif because there are no new individuals who are added to the list of this Isur, but it's an Isur Kolel because now you have an Isur that is Kolel more activities, more actions. It's the same individual called Mazar, but whereas before, previously on Chol, he was not enjoined from doing Malacha, now with the onset of Shabbos, he becomes Asur b'Malacha. Okay, so that's called an Isur Kolel. And we understand the first of the 3 cases about which there was a machlok shin Rab Chia bar Kapara, namely Zar Sheshimish b'Shabbos, that can be classified as an Isur Kolel, about which, according to Rab Chia's understanding of Rabbi Yossi would hold Isur Chalal Isur, just like he holds Isur Chalal Isur and an Isur Mosif, who adin the same law applies in Isur Kolel, whereas Bar Kapara says no. Although Rabbi Yossi is moda that Isur Chalal Isur be'Isur Mosif, like the case where Reuven subsequently marries Rachel and is Mosif Acherev, meaning the other brothers in the Isur Erva vis-a-vis Rachel. But in the case of an Isur Kolel, like Zar, She Shimesh B'Shabbos, there says Bar Kapara, Rabbi Yossi would hold Ein Iser Chal Iser, and he's only Chayav Achos. Now we go through the second and third cases. The second case is Balmum Sheshimesh Betuma. He was a Balmum. He's excluded from Avoda in the Mikdash, and now he became Tamid, which adds another Iser of Avoda in Mikdash for a Tamid. This is also going to be an Iser Kolin. Why? Balmum Meikara Shari Bachilo. V'Aser Bavoda Itamile Migudika Mitzah Bachila Mitzah Nami Bavoda. We have an Iser Kolil in the case of Balmum who became Tameh. Not in the same way that we spoke about Zar Sheshimish B'Shabbos. In Zar Sheshimish B'Shabbos, the Iser Kolel was adding malachos. Here, in the case of Baal Mum Sheshimish B'Tumah, the Iser Kolel is adding a dimension of achila. Until now, we had, before the Balmum contracted tumah, we had an Iser Avoda, but there's no Iser tumah, meaning a Balmum who's a Kohen is allowed to eat kodshim. When does it become prohibited in his kodshim? When he contracts tumah. When he's contaminated, then he has, so now with the onset of tumah, the Balmum's scope of Iser expands from an Iser Avoda to an Iser Achila. And Nigut, since the Iser of Tumah is Chal vis-a-vis Achila, it's now Chal vis-a-vis Avoda as well. So therefore, when the Balmum does the Avoda, and he's also a Tameh, he incurs Shtayim. That's how Rabbi Chia understands Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi holds Iser Chal Iser not just in an Iser Mosif, but even in Iser Kola. Ella, but what about the third case? Here we're going to be hard pressed in the third case, which is called Zar Sha'ochal Malika. Very difficult to get an Iser Kolil. What happens is that we're talking about Chatas Ha'of, which is not subject to Shchita, but rather to Malika from the Oref, from the back, and that makes it Basar Nevela. And the Gemara says, "Ela Malika b'vasachas hida mishkachas la, but be'iser kolel lo mishkachas la." When he does Malika to the oath, and he adds an Iser Nevela to what was previously just an Iser of Zorus, he's not a Kohen. So when a Zar eats from Kodshim, in this case from Chatas Ha'of, he is encroaching on the Kohanim. I guess you could say he's embezzling from the Kohen their rights. Let me just read to you. He writes here. According to Rabbi Chia, is Chayiv Shtayim, number one, for the Iser of Zar lo yochal ki kodesh, and number two, for the Iser nevela lo sochlu kol nevela. And clearly we have here an Iser kolel. No, I'm sorry. What we have here is what's called an Iser b'vasachas, not an Iser kolel, because we're talking about the same piece of oath, which was before prohibited midin zarus, and now it's prohibited midin nevela after Malika. Because Malika is only matter the bossa for Kohanim, but not for Yisraelim. For as far as Yisraelim, you have an Iser nevela. And Bar Kapar is going to insist here in this case, ein Iser Chalal Iser, because it's not an Iser Kolel. So we don't understand Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia says in this very case that Rabbi Yossi would hold Yechayiv Shtayim. Why? It's neither an Iser Mosif nor an Iser Kolel. Is lo mishkachas lo. Both Isur Machal on the same oath. There's no Kolel. You haven't expanded it, like in the case of Zar Sheshimish B'Shabbos, you expanded the Isur Malacha. Or in the case of Baal Mum Shimesh Bituma, you expanded by introducing an Isra Achilu that didn't exist while he was a Bal Mumtar. But in the case of Malika B'Chatas Ha'of, the same Chatas Ha'of is now Asur, not only Midin Zarus, but also Midin Nevela, because Malika is Nevela. So you haven't been Mosif anything. And you haven't been Kolel anything. And at this point, the Gemara drops the ball on the original explanation, B'Maika Miflagi, that Rav Chia Bar Kapara arguing about an Iser Kolel, and comes up with a new explanation, namely Iser B'Vasachas. Ela Miflagi B'Iser B'Vasachas. So we're talking about a case where two Isurim Achal simultaneously. V'Alibed Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi was the one who said Chayiv Shtayim. And the question is Rabbi Yossi limited to an Iser Mosif, like in the case where the Iser Eishes Ach now is Mosif Acherim, the other brothers? Or can we say that the case of Eishes Ach, who's also Achos Ishto, is a case of B'Vasachas? And Rabbi Yossi would hold that in any case where two Isurim emerge simultaneously, B'Vasachas, we hold Iser Chalal Iser. That's going to be the subject of the Machlokas, Rabbi Chia Bar Kapara, as to how to interpret the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Chia Savish Rabbi Yossi B'Iser B'Vasachas Mechayiv Tarti. What would be a case of Iser B'Vasachas? Imagine a case where two brothers agreed on appointing a certain agent, the shliach, to marry on their behalf, respectively, two sisters. And the two sisters appointed their shliach to accept the Kiddushin. And now the two shluchim meet up with each other, and both the Iser Eishes Ach and the Iser Achos Ishto are Chal B'Vasachas. Rabbi Yossi says in such a case, Iser Chalal Iser. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, ain't Iser Chalal Iser, even an Iser B'Vasachas. So now we have to figure out what would be a case, right? And keep in mind, again, this was the sugi that we learned yesterday on Lamed Beis, that Rabbi Shimon holds that only an Iser Ach is Chal, because that's Nidon B'Chamura, it's a more Chomer Iser than the Iser Achos Ishta. So the Gemara says, Ubar Kapar Sovar, the Lo Mechayv Elachada, that Rabbi Yossi, even in the case of the Iser V'Vasachas, would say that you're Chayev one, because ain't Iser Chal Iser. And the case in which Rabbi Yossi said that you're Chayev Shtayim, that's for a different reason. That's because it's an Iser Mosif. So Gemara asks the following kasha. Fine. You have the case of Achos Isha and Eishesach. That could be Vasachas with the two shluchim. But now let's go through the three cases that Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara argued about and see if we could work them all out with a Vasachas. We know that the third case, which is Zar Shachal Malika, that's certainly Vasachas, because the Iser Zorus vis-a-vis this oath, and the Iser Nevela vis-a-vis this oath are both Chal simultaneously, immediately with the Malika. But what about the first two cases? For Hacha, in the first two cases of Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos and Balmum Sheshimesh B'Tumah, my Iser B'Vasachas. How could it be that both of these Isurim emerge simultaneously? It certainly seems that one Isur was Chal before. For example, in the case of Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos, already on Erev Shabbos, there was an Isur Zoros. That was before Shabbos, and then Shabbos comes and adds the Isur of Shabbos. In the case of Almum Sheshimesh B'Tumah, then the Baal Mum is enjoined from doing the avoda even before he becomes tummy. So he becomes tummy later on. And the Gemara answers, Zar sheshimish b'Shabbos. How do you get two isurim chal b'vasachas? Kegon di aisi shtei soros b'Shabbos. In other words, on that Shabbos that he did avoda in the Mikdash, and he's a zar, he became a gadol on that Shabbos, and he grew shtei saros. And then Havile Zorus for Shabbos Bahadi Adodi. Both Zorus and Shabbos are chal simultaneously, because until Shabbos he's a katan, and there's no chalos isa Zorus and a katan. When does he become Asur b'Torzav? When he has shtei saros, and that happened on Shabbos, and at that point we have the Isa Malach of Shabbos. And we can apply the same yardstick in the case of Baal Mum Nami, a Baal Mum Sheshimish B'Tumah. Kigon, and here the Gemara gives two possible scenarios. Number one, I see shtei saros ve'it milei. He was a katan, and he was a Baal Mum, and he became tamei before the shtei saros were grown. So he became also b'tor zar and b'toras tuma when the two saros came out. That's when he became a god. There's a simultaneity in the emergence of both the Isur Balmum and the Isur Tuma when he became a gadol and he produced two saros. Inami, another scenario, we have a sakin, a knife that would be contracted tumas mes, which is metamias ha'odom b'negiya b'maga, and we're talking about a case where Hoisa etzbo chatucha ad mashva achman. Never. His finger it's a very gory case, but it's about to fall off. And then, boom, he cuts with this sakin tuma the very last mashu. And at that moment, he becomes a balmum, and he became tameh by virtue of the contact between the sakin tmeya betumas mes and his finger, his bosom. The Gemara asks the following. Now, if we go back to the original machlokas between Reb Chia and Bar Kapara, back on Lamed Beis, then it says, Kofat Rabbi Chia v'nishba, kach shamati mi Rebbe, that Yechav Shtayim, Kofetz Bar Kapor v'nishba, avoda kach shamati mi Rebbe, Achas is Chayiv Achas. Each one took a shvua as to what Rebbe had taught them. What was the transmission of Rebbe? And we're assuming right now that the machlokas Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara revolves around the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. When does Rabbi Yossi say Isser is chal on Isser? And each one took a shvua that he heard that from Rebbe. So Rabbi Chia took a shvua that he heard from Rebbe Yischav Shtayim, and Bar Kapar took a shvua that he heard from Rebbe Yischav Achas. And the Gemara wants to figure out what's going on over here. Bishlei Mil Rabbi Chia. You could understand, according to Rabbi Chia, where Bar Kapar could have possibly taken a shvua that you only chayv achas from Rebbe. The Chiasne, when Rebbe taught that you chayv achas, Lididei, according to Rabbi Chia, who holds that Yechav Shtayim, I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi. So again, Rabbi Chia took a shvua that he heard from Rebbe that Yechav Shtayim. And that means that I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi, the way Rabbi Chia understood Rabbi Yossi, Yechav Shtayim. And that's when he took an oath that he heard from Rebbe. Because in the case of Masachas, even though Rabbi Yossi in general holds Ein Isur Chal Isur, is moda that Isur Chal Isur. Now, Rabbi Chia could understand how Bar Kapara could have taken a shvur that he heard from Rebbe Achas, Asnei le Bar Kapara aliba de Rabbi Shimon, el de das Bar Kapara. Oh, okay. So let's go slowly now. So according to Bar Kapara, who took a shvua that Rebbe said you're only chayav achas, that was a libder of Shimon, meaning Bar Kapara made a mistake. He thought that Rebbe, when he said chayav achas, was talking a libder of Yossi. No. Says Reb Chia, that was a big blunder of Bar Kapara. But in truth, Bar Kapara did hear from Rebbe that you're only chayav achas, and therefore you didn't take Bar Kapara was not guilty of a shvur sheker. But that's according to Rabbi Shimon. Bar Kapara thought it was even according to Rabbi Yosef. Ella, but here's where we get stuck against the brick wall. Ella le Bar Kapara. How did Bar Kapara justify in his mind Rabbi Chia's shvua that he heard from Rebbe that Yechayev Shtein? Rabbi Chia Shikure Kameshaker? Is Rabbi Chia making a shvua sheker in Bar Kapara's mind? Is that what he's accusing Rabbi Chia of doing? I mean, after all, Bar Kapara said that even according to Rabbi Yossi, in a case of Shnei Yisur Machal Vas Achas, you're only chayav achas. Kolshket according to Rabbi Shimon. So therefore, there's no room for Rebbe to have made a comment that you chayav shtayim. He couldn't have meant it according to Rabbi Shimon for sure not, but even according to Rabbi Yossi, because according to Bar Kapara, Rabbi Yossi agrees that ein isur chalis or even vasachas. Elo, so now the Gemara has to say that let's shift our emphasis. Until now, we've been discussing a machlokes Rabbi Chia Bar Kapara within the framework of Rabbi Yossi. Let's shift over to the other side, into the domain of Rabbi Shimon. Ela kamifli be isuras achas aliv Rabbi Shimon. According to Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shimon says ein isur chal isur in a case of an isur kola, but in a case of an isur basachas, he concedes that both isur machal simultaneously. Otherwise, which one are you going to choose? Whereas Rabbi Shimon disagrees. I'm sorry. Did I say Rabbi Shimon? I meant to say Bar Kapara disagrees, and Bar Kapara holds that Rabbi Shimon disagrees even in the case of us achas, and he holds Einu Chayav El Achas, which is kind of intriguing because if both Isur Machal Vasachas, which one do you have to will be Chal? If you're saying Ein Isur Chal Lisa, I don't know, which would you choose if they're both Chal simultaneously. So you're gonna have to weigh which is more Chamur and which is less Chamur. So now the Gemara has the same kind of a kasha that it had before. Bishlei Rab Chia Kamish Taba Lafuke L'Rab Shimon Michezke. Now the Gemara is asking a slightly different question than it asked before. The very fact that Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara respectively took a shvua means that there was some chidush that was so revolutionary they had to strengthen it with a shvua. So Gemara says, I understand Rabbi Chia, he needs to take a shvua. Lafuke L'Rabbi Shimon Michezke. We know that Rabbi Shimon holds that in a case of two isurim, ein isur chal isur, and that's even the case of an isur kolel, like in the case of Eishes Ach and Achos Ishto. Now you want to tell me, Rabbi Chia, that Rabbi Shimon is moda that isur is chal al isur, namely in the case of Asachas, is then the burden of proof is on your shoulders, and therefore you have to be mechazik your tvarim because you have a radical chiddush here that moda Rabbi Shimon Asachas. And therefore, you took a shvua. El Bar Kapara lamali lishtabuye. And Bar Kapara is simply applying Rabbi Shimon's halacha that there's an absolute unqualified rule of ein isur chal isur yoli chayv achas. He writes here, the im nishba kidei lahotzi midivri Rab Chia sha'amar shemoder Rab Shimon b'isur vasachas lohelo lishava. He didn't have to take a shvua. If he's coming to argue against Rabbi Chia, he doesn't have to take a shvua. Rabbi Chia has to take a shvua. He's changing it to hold all the rules of the game that apply to Rabbi Shimon. And now he's saying that Rabbi Shimon is moda that both Yisur Machal and Yischav Shtayim. Bar Kapara is taking the easy path. He's telling us exactly what Rabbi Shimon holds straight across the board. Ein Isur Chalalisus. The Gemara answers kasha. Now the Gemara has another kasha. Bishlei Bar Kapara, who holds that according to Rabbi Shimon, even in the case of Asachas, Ein Isur Chalalisus Yoli Chayv Achas. I understand what he was saying in the name of Rebbe, that Rebbe holds Yechayv Ala Achas. And I can even understand the toes, according to Bar Kapara, of Rabbi Chia, who says that he heard from Rebbe that Yechayv Shtayim. He asne Rebbe Lididei, when Rebbe taught Bar Kapara that Yechayv Shtayim, that Yechayv Achas, is I'll leave the Reb Shimon. Rebbe was telling Achas I'll leave the Reb Shimon. But however, why did Reb Chia take a shvua, and Chas Shalom not a shvua sheker, that he heard from Rebbe that Yechayv Shtayim? He asked the Reb Chia, I'll leave it to Reb Yossi. Because Reb Yossi holds that Isur Chalal Isur, we saw it in the case of an Isur Kolel, and now we see it in the case of Isur of Chalam, Shnei Isur Shechalal Vasach. El Reb Chia, how is Reb Chia going to justify the shvua of Bar Kapara? Reb Chia holds in the name of Rebbe that Rabbi Shimon is moda, that in the case of Isur Basachas, we apply Yesh Isur Chalal Isur Yechayv Shtayim. So it comes out that Rabbi Bar Kapara, who says in the name of Rebbe that you're only Chayv Achas, Shikuri Komeshaket. There's no way of justifying the shvua that Bar Kapara says, I heard from Rebbe that you're Chayv Achas. Because according to Reb Chia, there is no such thing as being Chayv Achas in a Vasachas situation. Even Reb Shimon who holds Achas here admits that it's Shtayim. Amalecha Reb Chia, Ki Asni Rebbe Lididei, Tarte Liftur Asni. Again, Amalecha Rebbe for sure Bar Kapara did not take the shvua sheker. That's obvious. He made a mistake in what he heard from Rebbe. It was a toes. What was his toes? He asked the Rebbe Lidite, when Rebbe was teaching Bar Kapara, Tarte Liftur Asne. Rebbe didn't say to Bar Kapara that Yechayv Achas, but rather in two cases out of the three cases that Reb Chia and Bar Kapara argues about. For example, Zar Sheshimish B'Shabbos. Number two, Baal Mum Sheshimish B'Tumah. Bohem Sover Reb Shimon she'ena Yisra Sheni Chal v'chayv rak achas avol bedin zar shacham alika, which is a case of a vasachas by definition, is Rebbe never said that you're chayav achas, because according to Reb Chia, in a case of vasachas, even Reb Shimon kuliyamalo pligi that you chayav shtayim, because both these surim emerged simultaneously. And if Bar Kapara heard from the mouth of Rebbe HaKadosh, that you're chayav achas, and he took a shvua to that effect, and it wasn't a shvua sheker. So in what context did he hear from Rebbe that Yechayv Achas, meaning Bar Kapara? What was his mistake? It was Tarte Liftur Asne. In Tarte, in two of the cases of the three, is there he heard from Rebbe that Yechayv Achas, because those weren't cases of Vasachas, because the Zar was already Asur in Zorus on Erev Shabbos, and then on Shabbos he became Asur in Malacha. The Baal Mum was already enjoined from doing the Avodah and from eating from the Kodshim before he became Tomei. And here we're going to apply the principle of Ein Isur Chal Isur according to Reb Shimon, and that's exactly what Bakapartik Shvua that he heard from Reb.